Welcome everyone to CEJA's 5th Annual Environmental Justice Agency Assessment Briefing. Today we'll be discussing our 2020 agency assessment and engaging in an interactive discussion to help agency staff learn ways to improve environmental justice performance at state agencies. We're dropping a link to the agenda in the chat box now so that you can follow along today. As folks sign on, I invite everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat box by typing your name, community, and organization into the chat. And you may also like to share why you're here or what you hope to get out of today's briefing. So for example, I will drop my own in the chat. My name is Leonella Leone, and I use she and they pronouns. I'm joining today from Woodland, California on Potwin land, and I'm a part of the CEJA team. I am very happy to see so many people here today to learn more about the EJ principles and state agency performance on environmental justice during the historic year that was 2020. So I see a few are rolling into the chat, and we can give you all a moment to introduce yourselves. Perfect. Welcome, Naveed from CPUC. See Cassie also dropped her introduction in the chat. Welcome, Melissa. Wonderful. It's wonderful and great to see 105 participants here today virtually. Thank you everybody so much for attending. And I'd also love to give a special thanks to all of those who made this 2020 EJ agency assessment happen, including CEJA's members and partners, APEN, CRAWS, CDE, CRPE, CCAEJ, EHC, Leadership Council, Poder, PSRLA, and SCOPE. Our ally organizations, Californians for Pesticide Reform, Central California Environmental Justice Network, Community Water Center, and Earth Justice, as well as our funder partners, especially the Resources Legacy Fund for its generous support. And now I'd like to review the agenda. So we are just now dropping a link in the chat in case you'd like to use it to follow along today. Up next, we will be hearing from CEJA's Executive Director, Gladys Limon, who will provide introductory remarks. After that, CEJA's Special Projects Manager, Cassie Manjikian, will discuss this year's agency assessment and help you develop a deeper understanding of our AEJ principles. We'll then hear agency case studies from CEJA's member and partner organizations. They'll provide examples of how we apply our EJ principles and the ways in which state agencies can improve their performance. Afterwards, we'll have a Q&A with our speakers, take a group photo, followed by a 10-minute stretch break. And when we return from that break at noon, you'll all be divided into a breakout room with about 15 other participants, which will be facilitated by CEJA staff. And for that next half hour, you'll have the opportunity to share and learn with one another about how state agencies can implement environmental justice principles in their work. And before we reconvene from those rooms, each breakout room will ask an agency staff person to share takeaways from the discussion to our larger group here today. And lastly, we will adjourn at 1 p.m., at which point we'll email you all a copy of this year's final EJ agency assessment report. So without further ado, I'd now like to welcome CEJA's Executive Director, Gladys Limon, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Leonella. Good morning, everyone. I'm Gladys Limon and proudly serve as CEJA's Executive Director. Thank you for joining our 2020 EJ Agency Assessment Briefing. My colleagues and I send good wishes to you, your colleagues and loved ones, and we hope that as we emerge from what is hopefully the worst of the pandemic, you remain safe and in good health. CEJA is an alliance composed of 10 of the leading environmental justice organizations throughout California. Through CEJA, our members unite their powerful local organizing in communities most impacted by pollution and other environmental hazards to build power and advance policy solutions statewide. Together, we've achieved groundbreaking wins and shaped public discourse on transformative climate, energy, and green zones policies. We're proud to release our 5th annual Environmental Justice Agency Assessment for 2020. Our 2020 assessment reflects a historic, deeply challenging year for environmental justice communities. 2020 was indeed a daunting year of converging crises: COVID-19, the climate crises, and a heightening of overt systemic racism. Many of us stood in despair and outrage as we witnessed a tragic unfolding that communities and advocates have fought to prevent. Communities whose health has been jeopardized because of the very air they breathe suffered higher fatality rates and more serious illness from COVID. COVID magnified the racial health inequalities resulting from systemic discrimination, including environmental racism. Studies show that the chances of surviving COVID and the severity of the illness increased or decreased based solely on where one lived. What most determined one's fate is how much polluted air you breathed before the pandemic. So people living near transportation corridors, power plants, agricultural towns, those exposed to nitrogen oxide, from the burning of fossil fuels, and particulate matter worsens one's chances of survival. And so that your zip code also determined whether during the pandemic you had access to open green space for exercise, play, and mental well-being. It is during a health crisis that we most depend on governmental leaders and agencies to provide critical leadership on behalf of vulnerable populations. All of our states' environmental regulatory bodies hold core responsibilities to protect human health and the environment. Yet, in 2020, we saw agencies' performance slip, with the grade average dropping from a C in 2019 to a C- in 2020. This is an alarming outcome during the COVID-19 pandemic. Communities with poor environmental health needed expedited, focused, and unwavering action and commitment to decrease air pollution and increase environmental benefits. We did not, however, see such urgent action. The health and humanitarian crisis of 2020 is a preview of what lies ahead in light of the accelerating climate crisis. California's environmental regulatory bodies must urgently take the necessary action and make investments to protect the health and safety of the most vulnerable. Worsening air pollution from fires, increasing heat, drought, infectious diseases will continue to impact low-income people and communities of color worst. From who can cool their home, who can shield their bodies from pollution, who can reliably drink water from their tap, to access to health and safety services. The glaring underperformance of environmental regulators in 2020 again demonstrates the dire need to directly address our state's interconnected crises of racial, economic, and environmental injustices by centering equity. Our state agencies have a unique window to leap forward in their commitment to ensure the health and safety of all Californians, including by advancing an equitable, just transition away from fossil fuels and polluting industries, and by meaningfully engaging working communities of color and choosing effective, sustainable solutions. Agencies can address the crisis in a way that respects the human dignity and rights of all residents. This is a time of transformative need and potential. You and your colleagues have formidable challenges and real opportunities to move us toward a shared vision of healthy, sustainable, and prosperous communities with a sound future. It is in that spirit that we offer the space for us to learn together, to chart a course to improve agency culture and actions, to create environmentally prosperous conditions in our most vulnerable communities. We hope that our agency assessment can serve as a tool to inspire new pathways forward that see our state agencies carry the mantle of climate and environmental justice. We hope you enjoyed this briefing and look forward to continuing to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys. Please join me in giving her a virtual round of applause for those inspiring remarks. So I'd also like to thank all of you for participating in this briefing. My name is Cassie Manjikian, and I use she, they pronouns, and I'm based in Los Angeles on unceded Tongva land. I'm CEJA Special Project Manager, and I have the privilege of managing this year's EJ agency assessment. I'll be discussing the report in more detail to help you as agency staff develop a deeper understanding of how you can use our assessment, especially our 8 guiding EJ principles, to improve your environmental justice performance. So why do we create the EJA agency assessment and what is its purpose? We're proud that it's the only report in the nation to assess how state agencies perform on environmental policies that impact low-income communities and communities of color. We created it as a tool to hold state agencies accountable to the people you serve and to provide tangible ways to make your work more equitable. You may ask, how do we measure environmental justice performance? Each year, we use our eight environmental justice principles to grade agencies' track records on how effectively you're integrating environmental justice into your policy implementation and proceedings. Broadly, the US EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people the meaningful involvement of all people with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, and says that this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to decision-making processes to have a healthy environment. So environmental justice is about both process and outcomes. It's about process, ensuring that communities are leading in identifying solutions and pursuing better environmental health outcomes, but it's also about those outcomes in reducing longstanding environmental health and disparities. So I'd like to now go through each of our environmental justice principles to break out those big concepts in ways that you as agencies can integrate them into your work. Next slide, thank you. And Leonella, I'm sorry, I think you're on Zoom host. Can you please mute other participants if possible? Thank you. So the first principle is to prioritize and value harm prevention, human health, and improved quality of life. This means not overlooking health impacts in favor of business interests or so-called cost effectiveness. We want for all Californians, especially our state agencies, to make improving the health and well-being of all Californians a top priority. The second is do no harm, which seems self-explanatory but bears a little discussion. What we're looking for from agencies is that decision makers' actions should not result in increased pollution or worse health outcomes for communities. Third is to prioritize environmental justice communities, both to confront the historic legacy of disinvestment in high pollution areas and also to recognize the current state of affairs in these neighborhoods. Agencies can and should prioritize environmental justice communities as a matter of equity. Number 4, meaningful community engagement. Communities deserve to have a voice in decisions that will impact them, but experience many barriers to engagement, such as proximity to decision-making, language access, childcare needs during key meetings, just to name a few. Decision makers should proactively partner with local communities, be culturally relevant in soliciting input, be responsive to community concerns, and transparent in their work to ensure continued engagement and accountability. The 5th principle is to be proactive. As agencies, you have the privilege of information and knowing what's going on at a macro level, and you should not wait for communities to come to you about a problem. If you see a problem, we ask agency staff to proactively reach out to impacted groups for ideas and feedback. The next principle is to take an intersectional approach. As Gladys explained, environmental justice communities have been disinvested in economically and impacted by patriarchy, systemic racism, and state violence. To be more inclusive, we encourage you to not only reach out to communities, but reach out across agencies so that policy solutions address multiple intersecting issues that impact EJ communities. The 7th principle is to be responsive. We want agencies to not only reach out initially, but engage in continued dialogue and follow through until solutions are reached. The last principle is respecting community expertise. Scientific data often takes a long time to verify issues that communities have raised for years. We ask that you not only ask for community input, but trust what they tell you as truthful, valid, and worth acting upon in its own right to inform more equitable policy. So the next slide, please. So this is an overview of the agencies we assessed and the scores they received. This year, we assessed 5 agencies with a grade and designated 5 agencies to watch. For the 5 agencies to watch, this term doesn't have a negative connotation. It just means that those agencies didn't receive a full assessment this year. So you may be wondering, why did we select these agencies to assess? Each year, we assess agencies based upon our members' and allies' engagement in these proceedings. It's important to note that the assessment only reflects the proceedings in which our members engaged, so the grades don't reflect the totality of each agency's decision-making. Also, our assessment is only based on actions taken in 2020, so it doesn't include any prior context or actions that your agency has taken in the first half of 2021. As you can see in the chart in green, only one agency improved its performance in 2020, the California Air Resources Board, whereas the Department of Water Resources maintained its C-letter grade. As you can see in the chart in red, both DTSC and CalGEM's grades unfortunately worsened from 2019 to 2020, from a C- to D and C to D+ respectively. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that as agency staff, these mediocre grades can be hard for you to receive. Many of you are high-achieving scientists and social scientists and got where you are by performing at an A+ level. You may be wondering, is it even possible to meet CEJA's criteria for Gold Star on environmental justice? To answer that question, I invite you to look at the A- grades that the Strategic Growth Council earned in 2018 and 2019 at the bottom of the chart. While we didn't fully assess them this year, they and other agencies to watch, like the CEC, CPUC, and State Water Board, continue to provide more positive examples of proactive, transparent, respectful community engagement that other agencies can model and grow towards. Next slide, please. Overall, as Gladys discussed, agencies across the board unfortunately scored lower than they did in 2019. This is an alarming outcome, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, which hurt communities with poor environmental health most. And the good news is that there's much room for improvement to address California's internet-connected crises of racial, economic, and environmental injustices. Next slide, please. Moving forward, we at CEJA, with our alliance of member and partner organizations, are committed to working with the administration and agencies to promote environmental justice. In other words, this report isn't intended to be the end of the conversation. It's intended to continue and build upon long-standing conversations toward our shared values and goals of creating healthy, prosperous conditions in our most vulnerable communities. Ultimately, this report and today's briefing is intended to strengthen relationships between agencies and EJ communities to help change agency culture and actions toward improved on-the-ground realities for EJ communities. So to tie this all together, we're now going to hear agency case studies from CEJA's member and partner organizations. They'll provide examples of how we apply our EJ principles in tangible ways state agencies can improve their performance. If at any point you have questions, please drop them in the chat box and we'll save all questions till after the presentations. I now have the honor of introducing Shada Azamian, Leadership Council's Climate Policy Coordinator, and Paula Torrado, PSRLA's Air and Toxics Policy Analyst, excuse me. Shada's efforts at Leadership Council focus on coordinating community needs and priorities related to climate resilience and air quality with local, regional, and state policy advocacy. At PSRLA, Paula manages the implementation of the AB 617 Community Air Protection Grant by the California Air Resources Board that focuses on building community capacity to understand the state of the air in their communities and increasing community engagement in air quality policy at the state and local level. Shada, please take it away. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cassie. I hope everyone can hear me. And thank you to all the agency staff who are here today and have shown up committed to bringing learnings back to your institutions. What I'll say today is just a snapshot of the work CARB does and only speaks to the work we've engaged on produced by the agency as a whole in 2020. This is not based on the work of any one individual, but is meant to reflect the efficacy of CARB as an institution when considering what environmental justice should look like in our day-to-day. So I've been fortunate to work with CARB staff in many areas, such as the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program, Scoping Plan, and Zero Emission Freight and Vehicle initiatives. A little bit about what CARB does at a high level. CARB is the lead agency for climate change programs and oversees all air pollution control efforts in California to attain and maintain air quality standards. Their mission is to promote and protect public health, welfare, the environment through effective reduction of air pollutants, and while recognizing how the economy needs to move in a way that keeps our air clean as well. And the responsibility is to protect the public from harmful effects of air pollution and develop programs and actions to fight climate change. So as Cassie mentioned, the score that CARB got for the 2020 agency assessment is a C-, and we really do want to acknowledge that this is an improvement from last year, and thank CARB staff for the clear desire of some staff to learn from the feedback received over the years. The EJ principle I'll be highlighting right now is meaningful community participation. And I was really excited to highlight this one for CARB because I think there's been a lot of growth in the agency around this. We're seeing this even at the level of discourse among CARB staff as well, when we hear, and leadership, when we hear, CARB leadership talking about change needing to bubble up and be identified at the community level and really inform CARB's work. One area we've seen a real commitment to reach out to EJ communities is in the criteria pollutant and toxic emissions reporting. We really appreciate the outreach that's been done to EJ communities and the new public facing email to report facilities that we'd like CARB staff to look into. And when communities really want to know what emissions are coming out of this specific source or this specific facility. One area improvement in this criteria pollutant and toxic reporting area is the need for a comprehensive emissions inventory that is accessible and that we haven't really seen one updated for several decades. Another area is the 617 blueprint update. It's a clear opportunity for CARB to assume the responsibility it has to set process and expectations and working hand in hand with communities. It hit a couple bumps and we appreciate the efforts CARB staff here today have made to make sure the blueprint is still on track to becoming the most instrumental and enforceable guidance it can be. And then lastly, I'd be remiss not to mention cap and trade. It was not designed by community members, and we know this because community members have told us they would never design an emissions reduction program in which local sources are able to pay their way out of compliance. So the cap and trade program is a fundamentally flawed program that CARB does oversee and that unfortunately still underpins much of the state's climate strategy. So despite best efforts to amend the system, the rhetoric we often hear from institutions is about prioritizing environmental justice, but it doesn't quite hold up coherently against the existence of cap and trade. So with that, I'll just wrap up by saying throughout CARB's work, we really do want to witness a real reliance on community participation, community inclusion, and a reliance on delivering critical information and benefits to communities. Community members and the general public not only have the right to benefit equitably from programs and regulations that CARB develops, but also to contribute to their development and design. And we'd like to see CARB dedicate greater attention to building that capacity of the public and EJ communities to engage in the decision-making spaces with CARB. So thanks so much, and I'll pass to Paula, who will also speak to some of CARB's work.
Thanks, CEJA, for that great overview of CARB's assessment and CARB's core functions. And again, thank you to all of you for your time commitment and engagement in this process. In addition to CEJA's comments on the CARB assessment, I wanted to also highlight CARB's work on 2020 and its reflection on our community air quality work in South Los Angeles. So first, I wanted to recognize from our experience at PSRLA the work that CARB's EJ office and some folks at OCAP have dedicated to supporting our community air protection grant implementation, and also the AB 617 South LA Community Steering Committee. And I will name a few, and I apologize for putting some folks on the spot, but wanted to recognize that while there's a lot of work that CARB as an institution must do to truly commit to environmental and racial justice, we acknowledge some of the staff who are committed and ready to listen. And among those Artrice Johnson for her commitment to environmental justice and for amplifying our needs and the environmental justice voice at CARB's highest levels. Similarly, I wanted to uplift the work that both Deldy Reyes and Chanel Fletcher have dedicated to the AB 617 South LA implementation. While being new at the agency, they have demonstrated commitment to understanding how to meaningfully implement environmental justice in all CARB's programs. The institution itself must make real commitments towards embedding environmental justice voices and principles in all programs, designs, and implementations. So I wanted to focus on two environmental justice principles for CARB's assessment, and the first one is prioritize environmental justice communities. So for this one, throughout 2020, we could see CARB board and staff that was different, that was committed to increasing community engagement, as CEJA mentioned, within the AB 617 implementation process. And while the AB 617 program has presented new opportunities for communities to engage in air quality discussions, overall, the program continues to fall short on its promise to reduce pollution burden in its most impacted communities. And in order for the AB 617 program to meet the vision of its statutory mandate and to reduce the severe burden many communities face, CARB must make concrete commitments towards enforcing air quality improvements. CARB should also explicitly develop a framework to ensure that the valuable lessons learned and information gained through the community emissions reduction plans processes can be translated into benefits for all the overburdened communities by pollution burden, not just the selected few. On the second principle, take an intersectional approach. We also recognize the efforts that CARB has undertaken to listen to the communities in the development of its new technology clearinghouse tools, which is a step in the right direction towards identifying emission control technologies that can support the AB 617 process and bring real tangible solutions to communities on the ground. However, CARB must commit to pursuing a more intersectional approach to community engagement in air quality policy and move towards a statewide sector approach within identified high priority industry sectors. A focus on sectors rather than geographic regions would allow for a simpler regulatory system where emissions are reduced significantly across overburdened communities and could support the development of innovative policies that would require the mandatory implementation of the cleanest, safest, and least toxic emission control strategies that can limit the proliferation of regrettable substitutions in frontline communities, regardless of their AB 617 community selection. And I wanted to wrap up these comments with a quote by Marta Di Narguello, our Executive Director of PSRLA, that starts, "Agencies such as the California Air Resources Board have a moral and legal mandate to prioritize vulnerable communities by delivering actual long-standing reductions in air pollution, address climate change, and achieve environmental justice. Although 2020 witnessed small wins, such as CARB's zero emissions vehicle policies, the agency must do more to address the twin public health crisis of pollution and climate change. CARB must move beyond performative gestures on environmental justice and begin to shift the culture of the entire organization so that achieving environmental justice and a just transition are core at its mission and operations." And with that, I'll wrap it up and pass it back to Cassie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, CEJA and Paula, and really appreciate the questions that have already been coming into the chat, as well as appreciations from Chanel Fletcher, CARB staff. Thank you for joining us. If folks have additional questions for CEJA and Paula, please drop them in the chat and we'll save them until after the other presentations for Q&A. Next, I'd like to introduce Ingrid Brostrom, Assistant Director for the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, based in Delano, who will be discussing the Department of Toxics and Substances Control, or DTSC. She leads CRPE's toxics work and supports state legislation to advance environmental justice in the Central Valley and beyond. Welcome, Ingrid.
Thank you, Cassie, and thanks for everyone who has joined this call. I've been a real big fan of the agency assessment, for a long time. Because of the space it really provides to have interaction between environmental justice organizations and agencies, and really with the core goal of improving agencies in a collaborative fashion. And so I think these annual assessments have been a really important space. So I thank you for allowing me to join this year. I will talk a little bit about the Department of Toxic Substances Control, whose mission is to protect California's people and the environment from the harmful effects of toxic substances by restoring contaminated resources, enforcing hazardous waste laws, reducing hazardous waste generation, and encouraging the manufacture of chemically safer products. Obviously, this agency has a lot of different types of authorities, and so many of them touch upon low-income communities and communities of color. And so when DTSC isn't doing a good job, the impacts are felt so strongly among the communities that we work with. Unfortunately, the grade this year is a D, so it is lower than last year's score, but is generally in line with how the agency has historically scored. That being said, I did want to acknowledge a few bright spots for the agency. As with other agencies, we have seen a lot more communication between the department and with EJ advocates. And I also have witnessed a real desire to improve the agency. So kind of an acknowledgement that work remains to be done and that there are serious deficiencies within the agency. So that, kind of transition away from a defensive stance, which we have seen historically at this agency, to one of openness to change and a desire to change is real encouraging. I've also seen a new openness to collaboration. Really being open to innovative ideas to drive some of the structural changes that we think need to happen at DTSC has also been an encouraging trend at the agency. I think kind of butting up against that is just the serious erosion of trust over time, which we have seen in the past year has made it really difficult to have productive conversations with the agency. And we have gotten stuck in the past failures and the bad feelings. And really it comes down to a lack of sufficient accountability for the past harm that has stemmed from DTSC's actions and decision and has made it really difficult to move forward when we haven't had that accountability. And this lack of trust is made even more transient because the department continues to make decisions or to not make decisions that continue to harm to communities. Just a couple of examples is DTSC has not yet acted on Fibrotech, which is one of the longest standing expired permits in the state. The permit has been continued since the 1990s, and this is in a very vulnerable community. With Quemeco, we have this fear of having another Exide-like facility where there's evidence of migration of contamination and then a feeling that there hasn't been enough done to protect the nearby communities. We continue to see these glacially slow cleanups and remediation decisions are often not supported by communities, such as in Richmond around the Zeneca site. And this has been a trend for a long time. Communities tend not to agree with the remediation plans adopted by DTSC because it's cost rather than community acceptance that's really driving these decisions. And then we also see oftentimes unsafe soil caps as the primary protection given to communities. And so there's this ongoing harm that makes it really difficult to get to the place that we really need to have productive conversations. And so I want to close out with a recommendation, a heartfelt recommendation. We are at such a critical junction with DTSC. There's been so many conversations for so long, and the next steps in this next coming year will be so vitally important to rebuilding trust in the agency. And we have to take a very thoughtful and very inclusive approach to defining what success looks like. What is progress? What are the benchmarks that we need to collectively decide to make sure that DTSC is moving toward the agency that we all want to see? And so, performance metrics and benchmarks must account for and include EJ perspectives and impacted resident perspectives, rather than simply what DTSC would like to see for itself, because we need this broad based buy-in towards where the agency needs to go and what success looks like. And without that, it'll be very, very difficult for us to rebuild the trust that is really going to be necessary for the agency to succeed. And so with that, I think I'm going to close it there and pass it back to Cassie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for those really inspiring comments and remarks about DTSC's long progress toward environmental justice. And really want to appreciate you, Ingrid, and your leadership, who has really been involved in the agency assessment since its birth 5 years ago, and the ways you've worked on DTSC reform over the years. Again, if folks have any questions for Ingrid, please drop them in the chat box. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Amanda Monaco, Water Policy Coordinator with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. Amanda and the Leadership Council team work alongside communities in the San Joaquin Valley and Eastern Coachella Valley to organize and fight for sustainable groundwater management and for their rights to equitable access to drinking water. She'll be discussing the Department of Water Resources, DWR.
Excuse me. Thank you so much, Cassie. And thank you for CEJA for opening this space. As Cassie said, my name is Amanda Monaco. I'm a Water Policy Coordinator with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, located here in Fresno on ancestral Yokuts territory. And today I'll be speaking about the Department of Water Resources. So first I'll give kind of an overall view of the Department of Water Resources and get into a little bit about why we've engaged with the DWR and our experience working with them in 2020. Overall, the Department of Water Resources mission is to sustainably manage the water resources of California in cooperation with other agencies to benefit the state's people and protect, restore, and enhance the natural and human environments. So as part of that mission and its many water-related activities, DWR oversees the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And CEJA members, Leadership Council, as well as the Community Water Center interact with DWR within essentially two of those activities, water-related activities. First, it's implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and its a process to develop an agency-wide human right to water protocol. And I think we definitely want to note that DWR does so many things. This assessment is strictly related to those two activities, the implementation of CEJA and its development of a human right to water protocol. Leadership Council first became engaged in CEJA implementation because residents we work with throughout the San Joaquin Valley and the Eastern Coachella Valleys really depend on groundwater for their drinking water supply. Past mismanagement and overpumping of groundwater continues to cause many residents' drinking water wells to go dry, particularly in times of drought. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act gives us a new opportunity and a chance to correct this mismanagement if it's done right. Unfortunately, the groundwater management plans in the San Joaquin Valley alone will allow up to 12,000 wells to go dry, and the local groundwater sustainability agencies have no plan for mitigating those impacts. The Department of Water Resources is the regulatory agency for the CEJA implementation process, so it really has the power to accept or reject those local groundwater management plans. And it's in accordance with its obligations under the Human Right to Water law, DWR should be ensuring that those plans are protecting drinking water and doing whatever it can to guide the local agencies to make sure that they're protecting drinking water, particularly for environmental justice communities. Overall, in the CEJA implementation process, DWR has been very communicative and open to speaking with environmental justice organizations, which is very encouraging. In 2020, we continued to meet with DWR about our concerns. We reached out to DWR, began developing its human right to water protocol, and it put out implementation funding for CEJA. And as part of that, reached out to EJ orgs to design that funding in a way that would incentivize protection of drinking water supplies. for EJ communities and other underserved communities. It also launched a written translation services program to enable GSAs to support, to have written materials and presentations translated in up to eight languages. So those were some great positives from the year. However, as you'll see, the overall score was C-. So balancing those positives, we also saw some room for improvement, particularly related to the principles of being proactive, and prioritizing human health. Essentially, environmental justice organizations, quickly I'll add that environmental justice organizations really asked DWR to issue clear guidance to GSAs on how to protect drinking water and specify how it would evaluate groundwater plans to ensure they protected drinking water. However, DWR did not do those two things. And that was really key to environmental justice communities' engagement in SIGMA, really because residents of the communities that we work with, of environmental justice communities in the San Joaquin Valley and Eastern Coachella Valley, need to know that their drinking water resources will be protected and have that transparency and predictability in that process. But from our conversations with DWR and through the CEJA assessment process, we're really hopeful because we know that DWR staff see that there's much room for growth and want to work on being more proactive and protecting human well-being and the well-being and health of EJ communities. Yeah, and I'll just wrap up by saying that I'm grateful for the CEJA annual assessment process. I think it's really wonderful in creating more open spaces for increased understanding. So appreciate the space, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. Please join me in giving them a big round of virtual applause. You can hit the reaction button on your Zoom. Thank you so much. So now I'd like to lead us in a Q&A discussion. And in the spirit of engagement, I thought maybe we could stop screen sharing for a moment to see one another. We did have some questions coming in through the chat, which we answered some via some web links. You know, how do we define EJ communities? Who's included in EJ communities? How are the grades determined? Is there a specific criteria that lead to particular grades? We can, a lot of this is answered in the report itself, which we'll share with folks after the call. So I thought maybe we could wrap up with just one question for our speakers. Amanda, I'd like to ask you, how would you like state agencies to develop a better relationship with community residents and advocates throughout California, such as CEJA's member organizations?
Definitely. Thanks, Cassie. I think that everyone on this call has so much expertise. So I can't pretend to speak for what everyone experiences, but I know from Leadership Council's experience and my experience working alongside around 30 low-income communities of color in the San Joaquin Valley and the Eastern Coachella Valley, residents really want to know that they're being heard and their expertise is being taken seriously. So I think being proactive, reaching out to not only environmental justice organizations, but residents of environmental justice communities, because at the end of the day, they are the utmost experts on what they need, and things like asking for air quality to be protected and drinking water to be protected. They are the best experts in knowing how that should be done and how that needs to happen in their communities. So that's what I'll say for now. Thanks, Cassie.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda. And maybe we could do one more question for Ingrid. What suggestions do you have for state agencies to improve their efforts in addressing systemic racial justice inequities?
Thanks, Cassie. And you know, I actually want to get quite specific. I mean, there's lots of things that agencies can do, but you know, something that we have struggled with in the past is, you know, we've seen better communication, engagement, and it needs to not be a check mark, because what we really need to see is different decisions at the as the outcome of this increased engagement. And so, you know, something that has been, really important for environmental justice advocates for the longest time, is the actual consideration of social vulnerabilities, of cumulative impacts in agency decisions. And time again, we hit this brick wall where it's like, well, that's a local decision, or that's a zoning decision, or that's not our job. And so, I mean, in terms of getting real serious about the jurisdiction of agencies, it's actually including these criteria in your decisions. We've seen a movement towards that in New Jersey. And it's a movement that, we're trying to have with DTSC, for example. But local decision makers is inherently political. And we would like to think that the agencies of our state, really come down to protecting the people and have a real important job in looking at its decisions through the environmental justice lens, and really looking at how those social vulnerabilities and how those cumulative impacts fit in to your own jurisdictions. And so, I mean, that's one example, but something that's really important for the EJ movement.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for taking on that really tough, complex question in a short amount of time. And thank you again to all of our speakers. So I'd like to lead us in a quick group photo before we break. If folks can maybe come off video for a moment and show a smile or fist bump, our media manager, Isa, will take a picture. So thank you. Smile.
Just gonna do one more. Sorry, one last one. Thanks everybody. And great, thanks so much.
Thank you all. So it's now time for a 10-minute stretch break, during which you can turn your video off and grab some water or a snack. And during the break, I invite you to reflect upon 2 questions, which we'll leave on the screen and drop in the chat now. And when we return at noon, we'll divide into breakout rooms to discuss them. So we'll now play a few social justice movement songs, and we look forward to seeing you back at noon for our breakout discussion. Thank you all. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for participating in the breakout room discussions. We will wait a few moments for everyone to arrive. So I hope everyone had a rich discussion, and we're now going to hear an agency report back. So I'll call on the individual who volunteered from each group to share key takeaways with everyone. And we ask that you please keep your comments to about 2 minutes each, and we'll go ahead and stop screen sharing for the discussion. Great. Okay, so first I'd like to call on Renee from my group with the CEC to please unmute yourself and share key takeaways from Breakout Room 1. Thanks. And a reminder to unmute yourself, Renee, when you speak. Good, yeah. I see, Renee, that you're not muted, but I don't hear you.
Renee may be using different feeds for audio and video, perhaps.
Oh, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, she was in my breakout room and didn't have trouble hearing her. Yeah, maybe Renee, we can take a moment to figure out your audio, and in the meantime, move on to another group. So let's see, Mabel, can you call in the person from your group?
Yeah, Cassie, it's actually me. So I'm happy to share on behalf of our group, just pulling up my notes again. We're Navid, Christina, Javier, Sequoia, Melissa, and Marvin. And we had a really diverse group of folks from different agencies, from the Department of Water I'm gonna get it all. I'm gonna mess it all. But from CPUC to CalGEM to California Transportation Commission, Water Resources Agency, and forgive me if I've gotten one, but just really grateful for our conversation today around an intersectional approach in intersectional solutions. So thinking about how committing to equity frameworks across the different agencies, bringing forward stakeholder groups that are comprised of advocates and stakeholders from across the state, and resourcing and contracting with local residents for local culturally competent translation in written and spoken materials. Trying to think if there's anything else. And also an impressive kind of third-party facilitator who works with communities that are outside of governmental agencies and the institution to work on solving conflicts around sustainable groundwater management. So really employing a lot of different solutions creatively to think about how to best serve residents and in community engagement, transparency, and accountability.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mabel. Sounds like a really rich conversation. Love hearing about all those creative ideas and solutions. So now I'd like to call on Maria Rubin with the DTSC from CEJA's Breakout Room. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. It's Marcia. Hi. I thought we were Breakout Group 3. Good afternoon, everyone. So we had a really rich discussion about, just the challenges we face as agencies, challenges during COVID, and then, how best to address those and really kind of dive into, really making our decisions and going through our processes with EJ principles in mind. And, when we know it, hearing from the others at different agencies, we have a lot of the same, resource issues, recruitment issues, classification issues, and, in trying to work better with each other and with communities, it's really about that openness, shared resources, and remembering that we're all on the same side that contributes to better decisions and more informed decisions and more equitable decisions. And so that kind of coordination, taking the time to really do that, and leaning on each other to support those decisions can really help all of us integrate environmental justice principles into our work, regardless of what our specific oversight is. The more closely we're connected, the better we can all really do that. So that's my summary, unless anyone wants to contribute further.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marcia. Again, really appreciate the thoughtful and deep engagement and really thinking through, questions that likely apply to all agencies, right? So now I'd like to call on Monica Palmera with the CPUC from Alexis's Breakout Room for sharing from Group 4. If you can please unmute yourself.
Hey, yeah, can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, we had a good discussion in our group. We were mostly representatives from different state agencies, so definitely also saw some alignment in our reflections. But in, just to mention a few of them, we talked about, how the pandemic brought about this, remote access, and has really improved in many ways our public participation opportunities for folks from environmental justice communities to have access to our processes and our decision-making venues in ways that weren't possible. But but we also talked about how we're hopeful that, moving forward, we'll be able to maximize remote access while still considering in-person opportunities for building trust and relationships with communities. And we look forward to, what can come of that. We also talked about intersectionality quite a bit, and that many of our agencies are starting to work more collaboratively with other agencies. And for the CPUC where I work, and Sarah Sharp, who was also in my group, who we work closely together, that even within our agency, we're starting to be more collaborative and work cross purposes and cross industry areas, which wasn't always true. So we're glad to see that, and we think that's been a real improvement. And that also has been true in Cali, PA, across their boards and departments and in their enforcement work. They've seen a lot of good progress working collaboratively. We also talked about racial equity and a lot of work that our agencies are doing around creating racial equity plans, and how that's demonstrated a big culture shift for a lot of our agencies in terms of thinking about centering racial equity and having a plan in place that takes concrete forward steps. That's been really important for many of us. And many of our agencies, and in terms of also addressing issues of environmental justice as they relate to racial equity. Wanted to shout out that we had one of our members of our group is the new Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice at the Natural Resources Agency. So it's great to see that that position is there, and he was in our group, and that was really cool. We talked a lot about culture shift, and that there's been a lot of, like 5 years ago, a lot of our agencies weren't talking about this stuff, or it was a really, really hard, and thanks to the work that many of y'all have done and we see a lot of forward movement, and we're, continuing to work on that culture change that really is necessary to bring these, the needs of communities and their work to fruition. And I'm going to stop there. Is it just me, or did Cassie freeze?
Yes, I think she did.
Sorry, hopefully, can you still hear, y'all still hear me? Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, really appreciate those comments. So next, let's call on Isa, who will be sharing from Breakout Room number 6.
Hey, yeah, so we also had a really rich discussion. I just want to say thank you again to everybody who came out and joined this discussion group. We had Glenn, Alina, Patrice, Michelle, Ingrid, Christina, and Priscilla, representing a mix of agencies, departments, and then also including some advocates in there as well. And in terms of that first question, Glenn reflected on the first ever rulemaking in Spanish for the CalGEM rulemaking process and the series of 10 town halls. And Ingrid reflected that this was the first time that there had been a Spanish speaking rulemaking that that CRPE had the chance to engage with, and it really provided an opportunity for predominantly Spanish speaking community members from Arvin to participate. So lifted that out as a best practice for meaningful community engagement. Elena also shared a human right to water task force that's been forming in the last year or so to create a policy within the Department of Water Resources to engage with communities and create this task force to propel this campaign. And then there was also a really rich conversation that I will try to represent in shorthand, but Patrice and Ingrid, feel free to jump in. Patrice from Chief of Environmental Equity with the DTSC mentioned the need for this ongoing discussion between communities and agency and the continuance of this collaborative conversation, and reflected that EJ is not a monolith. And looked forward to redefining what success means in a series of continuing conversations. So I'll just pass that back over to my group in case anybody would like to add on there to that incredibly rich conversation. But that was our breakout.
Great.
I think that what you shared was beautifully shared. Thank you so much for that. You know, we were really taking a look at what does success look like? How do we define it? It has a different meaning for certainly different individuals, different agencies. And so it again is revisiting that and not having just the agencies define success, but how do communities define success? And we think that that's an important step for us to take to reach back to those communities and have that rich dialogue with them as we define our path forward collaboratively. So thank you, Isa, for capturing that.
Thank you so much to that breakout room number 6. That's really great to hear. So I accidentally skipped breakout room number 5, Francesca Negri with DTSC from Eric's room. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure, and thanks so much for the opportunity. What a rich dialogue we had. And our group was comprised of regulatory agencies and a nonprofit. And there was, you know, I'm going to reverse the order of my response to the questions. You know, COVID had a significant impact, I think, on how we engage. And in some instances, the use of what we're using today, which is, you know, the Zoom tool or the the Teams tool, we were able to increase participation, but we all agreed that the takeaway from that is that sometimes the quality of that participation was impacted by our inability to meet face-to-face in the same space. So we're looking forward to, you know, that time when we can be in the same space again and have that meaningful dialogue. I would say that there were some discussions of programs that were rolled out or you know, both internal and external. But you know, the theme is common from the other participations and the other participants' presentations here today, and that's in increasing collaboration. We may think that we're delivering a program that's serving the needs of our communities, but if we're not engaging with those communities in a meaningful way and getting that feedback, you know, we'll never know whether or not the service or the program that we're delivering is you know, being delivered as intended. And so there was some conversation about that. And then importantly, you know, when we talk about, and we've heard this in some of the other speakers as well, it's internal culture. When we talk about engagement, you know, we can, as executives in our organizations or as managers in our organizations, you know, set goals, or we can you know, set expectations for engagement, but doing the hard work of cultural shift has to be intentional. And so I'm going to borrow from Ingrid's discussion of DTSC. It has to be more than checking the box. And so many of our organizations under CalEPA have been working internally on racial equity. We've some of the organizations, including DTSC, have recently provided training on implicit bias. And that work has to continue. It has to be consistent. And we need to find, you know, we had the training, got a big boost, but now what? The next step is we need to continue those conversations, continue to talk about what meaningful engagement means, not only internally, but with our external stakeholders, and what it means to have implicit bias and its impact on the communities that we're serving. Really important work and rich dialogue about the need to have that internal work and to commit to it and to continue it in addition to increasing our engagement so that engagement is more meaningful.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for those really powerful comments, especially reflecting Ingrid's spirit and around those internal cultural changes that need to be made. Karen Buckley with CARB from Paula's breakout room number 7. Would you like to go next?
Sure. We had a really great conversation in our group. I just kind of want to start out and say that a lot of us talked about our agency's internal reflections, like a lot of us have mentioned today. In my agency, they have talked a lot about these changes that they would like to see agency-wide. They have started hiring at the executive levels to start showing the changes that we're making and to have support as we move forward as an agency. There was some discussion of intersectional approach, and one of the examples from our sister agency at DPR was their sustainable pest management work group. So that's just getting started, and it was encouraging to hear about. Community engagement improvements. I think that we were all looking for new ways to do this engagement, and a lot of it is reaching out and talking with community members to see what works for them, whether it's having the entire meeting in Spanish, or if it's having it at a certain time of day that might not necessarily be a time we would think. You know, most of the time I think everybody wants the meeting at 4. That's not always true. Could be at 7. So we try to be flexible in that way. Some of the barriers that we talked about, change in a large agency takes more time than we'd all like, but it is changing, and we are all working hard to continue that momentum. And the other thing that we talked about is challenging relationships that we can have with some of our agencies, whether it's DPR and their ag commissioners or us and our air districts. You have to work those details out, but it can be a very challenging relationship, and it takes a long time to try to get stuff through. I think those are the main things that we talked about. The one other piece that I wanted to mention was a positive side of the Zoom aspect of everything is the ability to be able to talk to more people across the state. You know, I work in 8617, and we have, 15 communities that are in our program, but being on Zoom, I can talk to all of them. So I can go to any of the community meetings, and that way I have a better understanding of the voices that I need to uplift. So I can hear from different people across the state, and it helps us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yeah, great to hear the synergies across different agencies as well. I'd like to call on Meredith Williams with DTSC from Gladys's Breakout Room.
Thank you. We also had a rich conversation that touched on a number of the points that were already mentioned, and it was great to meet some folks from other agencies, Jonathan from Catholic Charities, let's see, Catherine, and I was joined by Jane and Nina from DTSC. So it was a lively, a good discussion. Some of the things that I think weren't mentioned as much in the earlier discussion were just the practicalities. For instance, Jessica from State Lands Commission talked about staff really adapting and really wrestling with how to implement the environmental justice policies. And there's been some acknowledgement that change is hard, and that's been a challenge. And really getting staff and teams to assess whether projects increase the burdens and have unintended consequences to EJ communities. And really making sure on an ongoing basis that, again, the only way to find out whether or not that's the case is to be in conversation. And so this question of what constitutes meaningful and meaningful engagement was something that came up for all of us. And it was interesting because all of us that participated were in different stages of implementation of our environmental justice work, and yet there are some very common themes. Jonathan talked about really, that affirmative approach of what is it going to take for these communities to thrive, and really bringing focus to people's health in the decision-making, in the implementation of an environmental justice program. And all of us that spoke to the challenge of not just showing up. As Ingrid pointed out, DTSC has been more available, is having more communication, but does it constitute meaningful engagement? And I will just give a further shout out to Ingrid, because the points that she made about the history of the department and what it could take to get past that history were very important to hear. And we do have challenges around that. So I think that's really the only thing I'll add is that at DTSC, we are having a very active discussion with our leadership team about doing our work through the lenses of the environmental justice principles. We're doing that not in a passive way. We're actively looking at our decisions and trying to build that muscle of asking ourselves how the principles are applying to the work that we're doing on an ongoing basis. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Meredith. And we just have one more breakout room, and hopefully folks can stay on maybe a few more minutes as we wrap up. Andre Martinez with DTSC from Raquel's breakout room.
Yeah, hi everyone, thank you. Andres Martinez here from DTSC, from the Office of Environmental Equity and Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs Program. The hard part of going last is that so many good things have already been said, but the things that I did want to highlight within our group, which has been mentioned before, is that I think resistance to change and resistance to culture within organizations is very difficult. But the change is sequential, and the change will take steps. And I think one of the first things that we really need to acknowledge is what we're doing here. And this is the first time I interacted with this group at this level, and I find it really fantastic, and it really plays to one of the discussion points that we had around the openness, working relationships with communities and community members, and cooperatively trying to find those challenges and creating solutions to it in a way that listens to what the communities are requesting and how the department can meet their needs, and that willingness to do it. And sometimes that willingness does have to come from within, and incorporating some of the trainings and mentions of racial equity, of environmental justice, and getting everyone in the department in a way informed as to what those environmental justice principles are and how they apply specifically to the work that they do on a daily basis, and how they're interacting with community members. And once that is established, and again, this is me speaking into the future, but once that openness and trust is established, to know that we're collaboratively working with community members and community organizations, I think we need to establish a way to be able to respond. That once these suggestions are made, that we can incorporate that into our decisions, and when they are incorporated or developing a plan to implement them, that there's a response back, that we can say, having a dialogue of this is what we did and this is how we did it, and we'd like further assistance in different aspects of it.
Thank you so much, Andre, for your comments, and thank you all for sharing. So we are at time, and really appreciate what everyone had to share out. So I'll pass the microphone back to CEJA's Executive Director, Gladys Limon, to close us out for the remaining few minutes.
Thanks, Cassie.
Gladys, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you, everyone, for attending our 5th annual EJ Agency Assessment Briefing. We hope that you found the presentation informative and helpful, that you better understand CEJA's EJ principles and where communities need increased action and leadership from agencies. We're grateful for those of you who are able to stay for the second half of our briefing to engage in conversation with each other and CEJA member staff. We appreciate the rich conversations and also recognize that your participation is a demonstration of your commitment to move environmental justice in your respective agencies. And also want to acknowledge that the work that you and your colleagues do toward this end is challenging. All of your agencies are complex and carry weighty responsibilities. And this work is hard and can be contentious. And when you're listening to critiques and poor grades, it can be discouraging. Again, this is really hard work. And also increasingly critical. So we ask that you continue your commitment, your engagement with EJ community members and advocates, and that you further your efforts to improve the health and safety and well-being of the most vulnerable and be part of the rise of environmental justice. So we look forward to increasingly partnering together, struggling together, and celebrating achievements together. We're dropping into the chat the link to our website for you to download our full 2020 EJ assessment report and executive summary. We encourage you to read and share them widely within your agencies or organizations. And please let us know if you'd like to further discuss the report. We also invite you to submit a quick evaluation about our briefing, which will also include is both in the chat and in email. And we'll be mailing printed copies of the report to the 10 agencies that are featured in this year's report. But if you'd like to request a printed copy of the report, that'd be mailed to you if you're not amongst those 10 agencies, please state that in the evaluation and we'll be happy to do so. And if you have any questions, you can contact CEJA's Special Projects Manager, Cassie Manjikian, whose contact information is listed here. And thank you so much, Cassie, Leonela, and to the CEJA team, to our member and partner organizations for all of your work and commitment to creating the tool, the report, and also the briefing. Thanks, everyone. Again, we look forward to continuing to build and strengthen relationships with all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.